I'm here to talk about government contracting, which is the subject of this panel discussion. I'd like to just do a few slides of framing the issues, and then we have more wisdom than mine amongst the persons on the panel discussion. Okay, so the first idea that we should ponder is that in India, state failure is the norm and not the exception. So all across the Indian landscape, whatever you look at works reasonably badly, whether you think it's the police or the judiciary or tax policy or tax administration or statistical system or financial regulation or health policy or agriculture or whatever. You look at any field in India, it works reasonably badly. As researchers, as thinkers, we tend to do deep dives into domains, and we tend to think of intellectual or political economy stories about agriculture or electricity or finance or exporting. But we've got to confront the fact that failure is happening all over the place. So, as a contrast, if things mostly worked well, but in a few areas there is failure, then maybe you want to do a deep dive and figure out something weird about that area. Why have we failed? As an example, consider the United States and healthcare. Okay, many elements of public systems in the US work reasonably well, while healthcare works really badly. So you think, okay, we've got some peculiar intellectual or political economy failure in the domain knowledge of health. When most things work badly, then by Occam's razor, we should be looking for explanations that are not domain specific. We should look for cross cutting explanations that span across domains. Okay, and the entire book that Vijay Kelkar and I wrote is mostly on these kinds of ideas that think of deeper cross cutting problems that afflict a large number of areas and sectors. Now, turning inside government organizations, there are four horizontal capabilities that have to be present in every single government organization. These are human resources, finance, transparency, and contracting. Again, each of these is a field. Human resources is how you hire people and fire people, how you measure performance, how you incentivize people. Finance is the machinery of money coming in, money going out, budgeting, and so on. Transparency is issues like what you publish, what is accessible to the public after 74 years, what details of a military operation will be made visible to historians, and so on. And finally, there is contracting. Each of these four is interesting because it's a cross cutting fundamental capability that is required in every single government organization. And God knows all these four have problems, but today we are here to talk about contracting. Contracting is a four-part story. First is the beginning of the pipeline where there is procurement and drafting of contracts. Then comes the problems of contract renegotiation. All contracts are necessarily incomplete. So, in the life of a contract, both sides will need to find a way to renegotiate the contract. Then there will inevitably be disputes, and then there needs to be ways to handle contract disputes. And finally, there you come to payments, and we're all very conscious about the delays of government payments. In India, we think there's a disproportionate emphasis on payments. A lot of people are talking and thinking about government being a bad paymaster. But it's important to see that bad behavior by government in payments is just the last step of an entire pipeline that is broken. It is because the procurement is bad, the drafting is bad, the renegotiation is bad, the disputes are badly handled. Then at the end point, you get the observed outcome that payments are done badly. There's no silver bullet that will just fix payments. You've got to go fix the whole thing. So we need to study government contracting in its entirety. The difficulties of government contracting are afflicting state performance all across the landscape. So, what is remarkable is that you study many different fields in India, and the choke point turns into government contracting. So, whether you think about defense or health or innovation policy or infrastructure or many other areas, again and again, the choke point comes out to be contracting. Let me talk a little bit about each of these. Let's take defense as an example. It is operationally convenient and it is politically convenient to source equipment from ordnance factories or public sector companies or Indian companies. But the fact is that winning wars requires the best equipment. So we should be loyal to getting good equipment and not to self reliance. And if you look back at the last 30 years, our track record on buying large, complex, state of the art weapon systems is just abysmal. We just don't manage to do a sufficient quantity and quality of procurement. So if you look in the global literature on national security and military affairs, books like Paul Kennedy, the conventional wisdom is that once you have high GDP, you will have carrier groups. And I wish to say that no, high GDP will not generate carrier groups if we don't have the state capacity to contract. We will need to do enormously complex contracting to buy and operate carrier groups. And at present, that contracting capability is not there in India. So even if you were willing to put 30 to 40 billion dollars to buy a carrier group, we don't have the contracting ability to do so. A choke point for military power is government contracting. Let's turn to health. Okay, at an absolutely elementary level, government needs to buy drugs. Okay, all over India, various government organizations are buyers of medicines, and that requires contracting capability. At present, there are many difficulties in the way government buys medicines. If you think about public health, for example, government needs to buy vaccines and contract with private persons to do vaccine delivery, and that will require contracting capability. If you think of healthcare, the government will need to buy healthcare for COVID 19 from private healthcare providers. Or imagine you want to run Ayushman Bharat, the government will need to contract with private persons and achieve healthcare services. And this is not easy. By default, private persons will skimp on the work that they do. They will try to extract money from the government and not actually deliver healthcare. So this is not a trivial problem. It takes work, it takes effort, it takes capability. What kind of capability? It's a procurement and contract management capability. So a choke point for health policy is government contracting. Let's think of innovation policy. These are conversations that Professor Mashelkar has been having with me for the last several weeks. Let's think of many elements of what is happening in the world of innovation policy. The first issue is government as a buyer. If we set up government purchase procedures that want a company to be minimum 100 crore of revenues for the last 10 years, then automatically you've choked off smaller and more innovative companies. And government purchases will not happen from smaller and more innovative companies. The next element is that government labs and universities have knowledge, but in order to connect up to private persons and commercialize that knowledge, we will need frameworks of contracting. And as long as contracting works badly, the partnership with private persons will be inhibited. Then the third area is a discussion around something like the comparison between NASA and ISRO. At present, ISRO builds the Mars orbiter, the Mars lander. Whereas the way NASA works is that the bulk of the work is contracted out to firms and universities who are outside the state apparatus. That creates competition, that diffuses knowledge. More private persons develop that same knowledge, and private persons will produce more effectively as compared to having a bureaucracy inside a government organization. Finally, government is a very important funder of research. We are all familiar with the United States DARPA, where the government has given out contracts to private persons and universities to grow at the frontiers of knowledge. Professor Mashelkar has built a system in India that is called NMITLI, which has many fascinating concepts where government has become a funder and a partner to private persons in taking knowledge from government labs and universities and putting government money on top of it and in building knowledge capabilities in India. When you put this whole picture together, we see that a choke point for innovation policy is government contracting. Consider the field of infrastructure. Government can build infrastructure, but generally, when the private sector chooses what infrastructure asset to build, and the private sector controls the contracting to build the asset and do the maintenance, these things generally work out better. Sudha Krishnan points out that even when you say the government can build infrastructure, actually the government is doing contracting in order to get the execution of those contracts. So in all this, you have either EPC contracts or PPP contracts. And we've seen how in the last 20 years this works pretty badly. So once again, this is all about state capacity in government contracting. A choke point for infrastructure policy is government contracting. These are only four examples. You could just go on and on. There are so many examples. Here's one simple one. Do you really need the government to own warehouses? When you pause to think about it, it makes no sense at all for the government to own warehouses. This is a contracting problem. The private sector should own warehouses. The government should run competitive bidding and buy the services of private companies who will run warehousing. What sense does it make for the government to own warehouses? But the way things are currently done, the government owns warehouses, and it's just complicated. It's taboo to think of contracting with private persons to own warehouses. If you look back at the last 20, 30 years, very often we think government is low capability, let's contract out to the private sector. And our big realization of the last 20 years is that contracting is actually pretty hard. So this is less good than meets the eye. So to summarize, if we could build state capacity in government contracting, that would be pretty transformative. So I'm at the end of these slides. What I'd like to say is that what we in the research community urgently need to do is we need to organize ourselves around four research programs. We need a research program on the four horizontals of government: HR, finance, transparency, and contracting. And in each of them, we need to do our usual machinery of documenting the present ways, doing case studies, building systems for measurement, doing root cause analysis about how the formal laws and procedures are generating the incentives through which bad things happen, and how these incentives generate the observed outcomes. Then we need to propose and debate alternative mechanisms through which these things can be done better. We need to draft better laws and better process manuals. And we need to think and learn how to build state capacity for implementing these new laws and these new process manuals. These seven steps are cookie cutter in any field in India. When you do public policy, this is the way it is done. So I would argue that in each of these four areas, we need these kinds of research programs. In my knowledge, there is only one of these research programs going on, which is the work that uh, Susan and her collaborators are doing in the field of contracting. So it's really great that we have begun in one of these four areas of trying to build the foundational knowledge through which we'll be able to fix these capabilities. So I'm at the end of my slideshow. I would now like to take off the slide and get back to the normal conversation. Okay, I'm going back to full screen. Okay, so here I am. I'm finished with the slides. That was 12 minutes. I hope that was okay. Professor Mashelkar, what do you think? You've been thinking about related questions for a long time, but here you are seeing us located as part of a larger problem. What do you think?
Yes, Ajay, that was a brilliant presentation. I think in 12 minutes, you really got the gist of the issue. I only understand innovation. I've been a student of innovation. And I will talk about the connect between innovation and public procurement. See, by very name, the innovation means doing things differently, doing things which have not been done before. That itself brings the contradiction because public procurement policies are based on certainties, no failure, prior experience, L1, the lowest cost, etc., which are the safest way of doing things. And when you are doing innovation, they don't necessarily. If you look at many countries outside, they support the public procurement policies in a huge way. For example, China has set up such policies. OECD members, for example, there's a great paper, 2017, titled Public Procurement for Innovation, Good Practices and Strategies. Almost 80% of the OECD members, they have taken sort of measures for supporting innovation procurement. And the results have been terrific. For example, one third of European companies have sold an innovative product, a truly innovative product or a service as a part of public procurement. So it works, basically. What are the Indian issues like? I think the tripod of talent, technology, and trust. We have all the talent, we have the technology. The issue is that of the trust, basically. How do you build it? First of all, our own confidence in our own products. Ashok Jhunjhunwala was a pioneer in wireless local loop. But Ajay, it was implemented in Brazil and Madagascar first before it came to India, having proven there. You know, if you look at Bharat Biotech, I was involved in that as a member of the Technology Development Board. We supported him. He created hepatitis B vaccine, which was absolutely world class. Finally, UNESCO, we had, I mean, UN Health had almost 40% of the supply coming from that. But he struggled, struggled, and struggled, and struggled. So how do you basically change that? I think that is the challenge that we have: talent, technology, and trust. The next is uh, what we can do. I think let me also tell you where we are lost out as a result of not having that trust or not having a public procurement policy. Today, Ajay, it's a very sorry state of affairs that out of 1.6 billion children who are out of school and working from home, online learning is possible if you have a device which is affordable or if you have connectivity. Now, you are having cases now of children committing suicide because they don't have affordable devices. It's a hard thing. Yes. Did we have the talent and technology? Yes. In fact, I'm tempted to read in a minute what happened in 2001. There was this computer. In fact, the New York Times correspondent wrote about it. This is most significant innovation in computer technology was not Apple's gleaming powerhouse 4G, not Microsoft Windows XP. It was Computer, net-linked, radically simple, portable computer. Right? And then he described how fantastic it was. What happened to it? He said it will transform. It did not. Because what was needed was a excellent public procurement policy. The government sort of buys, let's say, 10,000, puts them to use, gives a feedback, and then he builds, refines the design, and sort of move forward. I mean, that's what the rest of them do. Akash, for example, $35 tablet, 2,000. Then when I was the DG of CSR, we had this Mobilis that we created through the public-private partnership, the New Millennium Indian Technology Leadership Initiative that you talked about, basically. But just a high net worth individual sort of got. Now, all these devices, most affordably, would have been available today when online learning has become the norm. So I think we require these public procurement policies. The last point is that these have been the problem, but I'm seeing, let us say, changes. For example, state of Kerala, state of Maharashtra, where I'm co-chair of the Maharashtra State Innovation Council, we have created startup policy where we don't ask a Tendulkar, oh, you may be 15 and you have hit a century, but where is your 10 years experience? So we are doing away with prior experience. We are doing away with unnecessary deposit. We are doing away with so many other things, and trying to create a easy this. Kerala has done exemplary sort of models. That is because this wave of startup India that has come. Now suddenly we realize that if we don't do that, we will not be able to sort of move forward. So let me say these have been the problem, but I must end on a positive note that I'm seeing, let's say, positive development, some states taking lead, as a matter of fact, in moving this forward. As I said, finally, while ending, that talent, technology, and trust-based systems are very important. This book that you see here, Amitabh Kant has edited it, Path Ahead, Transformative Ideas for India. I have a chapter on this, on public procurement policies, which are innovative and bold, which can actually support us. So it can be done. Trust is the key.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Mashelkar. Shailesh, you have been on both sides of the fence. You've been a government officer signing on contracts, and you've been a private person experiencing misery of dealing with the government. What are your thoughts on what works and what doesn't work, and how it can be fixed?
I think misery is never a monopoly. So I'm sure that many in government would have not so good experience in dealing with some in the private sector. But I'll just say this, Larsen and Toubro is a very large group and it does a lot of construction. Uh, our company is a very small company focused on the private-public partnership kind of projects. So we did the Hyderabad Metro, we co-promoted the Bangalore airport from the private sector. But just to sort of inject one thought that has not been discussed so far in your excellent presentation. You see, contract enforcement is required for good contract design. Because even with the best contracts, if there is some mishap, then we can always game the system by going to courts and drag the process for the next 5 years. And to give a related example, I know so many SEBI orders on very, very clearly defaulting parties, which have not really been put in place because of the appellate process and no decisions. So one part of the research, since we're talking about research objectives, should certainly be how do you get contract enforcement through courts much quicker than we do today. And L&T operates in 30 countries. Perhaps in most of those countries, contract enforcement is much quicker. So that's the first question. Associated, although not from construction, is my friend who is in a very senior position in the government of Bihar. And the government of Bihar needs to focus on education. So in October 2019, the government of Bihar came out with an advertisement for hiring 90,000 teachers. Within 3 weeks, the High Court stayed this advertisement, and not one hearing has happened since. So 1 year of the 90,000 teachers that could have worked for the government of Bihar is zero. So maybe that is the first point that I'd like to begin with: contract enforcement through courts. Coming to specifically construction, uh, all of you know that we are in India going to build more in the next 10 to 15 years than we have built in the last 70 years. And this is going to be both in infrastructure and in real estate. And the biggest threat is not availability of money. The biggest threat is contracts and contract management. So having seen it from both sides, in the government, and here government is not a monolith, there is a city government. So a Nagpur or a Coimbatore municipal corporation. Government is a state government. Government is the federal government of India. And government is also central public sector units. All these four combined actually do a lot of contracting. And I would only say that the last two are much better at it than the first two, which is that the city governments are perhaps the most sort of in need of an improvement. The state governments certainly could do with a leg up. Government of India and the central public sector units are getting their act together. Having said that, what are the things that we can do better? The first part of any infrastructure project is actually the design of that infrastructure project. And the procurement of the advisor or the consultant or the designer for that infrastructure project itself is the sort of root of the problem. So you do a suboptimal design, you'll have a suboptimal constructed project. Good news is that we are moving for procurement of advisors and consultants to a QCBS system. So quality and cost, where the quality is 80% and the cost is 20%, which is essential for the design and the innovation, as Professor Mashalkar mentioned. So that is sort of being taken care of. The next is once you design the contract for the construction. And let me just add to what you said. 95% of all construction in India is not going to be on public-private partnership. It is going to be built by the private sector. It is going to be paid for by the government. But there is a contract between the government and the private sector contractor, which is actually quite pathetic today. It could be so much better. So when you have a contract that you sign on, it is not following global norms. And a simple example is in every state there is a public works department. They have a schedule of rates, and they have a specific kind of tender. One is called a lump sum turnkey contract. One is item rate. One is quantities and so on. But NHAI followed a very different contracting method, which is why the Golden Quadrilateral and the national highways took off in India. It would never have taken off using the same contracts as public works departments. So maybe that's another research question. What did NHAI do better than the state public works departments so that we could get our highways? The third is even before the payment, it is the contract administration and management. So let us say that the government gives a contract to build an agricultural silo or to build a convention center. Now that convention center is going to be built in 1400 days, and every payment has a benchmark and a milestone. But typically what happens is, and most people don't realize this, during the construction contract, quick decision making and administration of that contract is essential. And let me just say, we could do with much more improvement at all four levels of government that I spoke about. So contract management and contract administration is where half the contracts go bad. And let me give you a great example there. We have all probably seen the speech of Mr. Nitin Gadkari when he was not very kind to the officers in NHAI who took 9 years for a building of NHAI. This was not a PPP project. This was a fully budgeted project, and it took 9 years for that building to come up, and nothing else except contract management failure, contract administration failure. Finally, we come to payment. And now, thankfully, with digital payments, life is so much easier, but there are political economy issues that all of us are aware of. So let me just sort of compress all this to what you could do as a bunch of very smart people to help both government and the private sector in terms of contracting for infrastructure. You could actually look at the position in the United Kingdom in 1994. And if I can share my screen, let me just try. Uh, in 1994, pretty much the same problems were there in the United Kingdom. And they actually went in for something called constructing the team, which was a report by Michael Latham. On the basis of this, they went ahead and passed a specific law for construction. And today, I must say that from 1994 to, let us say, 2005, there was a complete transformation in the way things were done in the UK. I'm happy to send a longer note on this. But other countries have implemented similar laws. And it is time for India to recognize that if you're going to spend 111 lakh crore in the next 5 years on construction on the infrastructure piece alone, I'm not even counting real estate, then you cannot use the same bullock cart system that we have for contracts today. Right now, our construction contracts are governed by the Indian Contracts Act 1861. This is going to be the single largest obstacle to quickly converting ideas into assets on the ground. Essentially, the national infrastructure pipeline is an idea. It's a project pipeline. It has to be constructed into assets on the ground. Please help us with more efficient contracting, and maybe the Latham report is a good way to begin. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Shailesh. Sudha, you have lived on the other side of the fence in the sense that you have been the auditor, the financial advisor, watching as civil servants and private persons get all mad at each other. So, what do you think is going wrong, and uh, what are the angles through which these things can be made better, and to what extent is CAG a part of the problem, and does CAG need to do things differently?
Okay. Thank you, Ajay. Thank you for a very clear, as always, extremely clear and lucid presentation. Of course, I will come in from the angle of the government servant and probably try and bring in the government perspective on this very important issue of contracting. And I completely agree that there are inefficiencies in government procurements. I think all of us agree that there are inefficiencies in government procurement. I have, I have some experience recently of working with two departments, the Department of Space and the Department of Atomic Energy, which do large procurement of a slightly different kind in the government. And I've been, shall I say, pleasantly surprised at the reasonably robust system that that is followed in these departments. And I'm trying to ask myself, what is it that makes procurements more efficient in Department of Space and Atomic Energy as compared to other government departments? And is there something that we can learn from these two places, from these two departments, to try and scale across the board? So basically, I'm sort of coming in on generic government procurements. I'm not really focusing on infrastructure or innovation, which Dr. Mashelkar and Shailesh have already spoken about. As everybody has already said, probably the biggest problem that we have today in government procurement is articulating the need, what you would call the need assessment. And what we have found in, say, the Department of Space and Department of Atomic Energy, for instance, is that the need assessment or the articulation of requirements is much more robust. because these are project-driven departments, there is a lot of clarity on what is to be done, or who will do it, what are the timelines. There is very good documentation that is made available at every stage. There are very detailed manuals, process manuals, which govern the entire system. And it's driven at the very top, meaning the secretaries of these departments or the senior scientists of these departments are constantly monitoring and checking and reviewing and so on. And finally, I think all this over the years has built up a sort of a reputation of credibility and trust in their procurement procedures, which is perhaps what is lacking today in most of government. So if we need to build an atmosphere of credibility and trust in government, so that we and our vendors are both on the same page insofar as the contracts are concerned, planning and clarity in planning is going to be, I think, absolutely essential. A lot of the problems that we have in defense procurement, for instance, which you highlighted, is possibly because we keep changing requirements from time to time. And once that happens, you find that it's very difficult to factor that into a bid document. You get into all sorts of complications, and then the process becomes extremely slow. Documentation is, again, something that's very essential. And we do procure vaccines, Ajay, from the private sector. On the health side, you talked about the need to procure vaccines. We do procure vaccines from the private sector. Probably what we are not able to do, which is what you and Dr. Mashelkar have both spoken about, is we are not able to see whether we can procure them from more innovative or a more agile startups, companies, firms who are able to provide it to us at a better cost or maybe better value for money. And this is where all the documentation is going to be important, because something that I'd just like to point out, which is very often said to me when I talk to people about government procurement, is that government always wants to go for L1. But that's strictly speaking not true. The government financial rules provide for various options. We can do, of course, open tendering and go for L1, but we can also do a QCBS, which has been pointed out by Shailesh. And very often we can do limited tendering, or we can do a sole source procurement also, where we are extremely sure about what we want, and we are very sure about which is the agency or the vendor who can best supply it to us. And I can tell you that in both Department of Space and Atomic Energy, we follow this very often. But we have to document properly, meaning somebody has to record the reasons why they believe that this particular technology or this particular vaccine from a particular supplier is something that the government should be picking up. And once that documentation is done and all the reasons are recorded and there is application of mind, the process allows you to go ahead with it. The third thing that I've learned from space and atomic energy is the use of good manuals. Process manuals are very important when you're making big decisions on where government funds are involved, because obviously transparency, accountability, etc., are very important words that we have to play by. You asked me to speak about the role of the CAG. The CAG audits with reference to the processes that are in place. So if you have the processes well laid out, and you say how you can go about a certain decision, even if you don't want to follow an L1 route, or if you want to follow a route where you wish to encourage innovation, encourage a startup, the guiding principles have to be laid down in advance so that there is no misuse of discretion, since as we know, we are dealing with public money. And so the CAG, when he comes into audit, will always audit with reference to the process manuals and with reference to the procedures that have been laid down, which is why these manuals become terribly important. It's perhaps difficult to criticize just the CAG and say that you make life difficult for us, meaning for a procuring entity, because if there is no procedure in place other than an L1 procedure, everybody is going to ask questions. So I just want to repeat that there is a bouquet of alternatives available to government procuring entities. We do not necessarily have to go for L1. We can use other methods, but we must have documentation and manuals in place to guide us in making these decisions. And having said that, I should say that, as I said, we do follow these different procedures in both space and atomic energy. And we have very rarely had CAG audit observations on the nature of our procurements. You had raised one point in your presentation, which is on ISRO versus NASA, on the business of contracting out. It's a slightly different question from the issue that I've just discussed, so I'll take that separately. The last point that I want to make in connection with the processes is I've heard this conversation about the need for laws. I would like to place on the table that we've tried over the last 7-8 years, to the best of my recollection, to bring in something called a Public Procurement Act. There was a bill that was drafted. It went through many, many rounds of consultations, but it's not moved further. The reason being that there are such complexities in the way in which different government departments do procurements, that trying to bring in all these complex arrangements into a law became extremely difficult. And it also was felt that it's sort of binding government departments down more by enacting a law. Whereas in fact, it may sound strange when I say this, but I believe as a government servant that the so-called GFR, or General Financial Rules, that is the Bible that we all use when we do government procurements, allows enough flexibility to the procuring entity to decide how they want to go about something, what is the way in which they would like to do it, so long as there is application of mind. On the issue of ISRO versus NASA, yes, I agree. There is a big difference in the way in which ISRO does its work as compared to the way NASA does it. In Department of Space, or ISRO as you call it, we largely do the work ourselves. But when I say we do the work ourselves, when we build our own rockets or we build our own satellites, of course we contract it out. I mean, there are large contractors, including L&T, for instance, or Tata's, or you name them, who do the work on behalf of the department. But I think what you are trying to say is that government need not be in the business of building at all. And in fact, government can move away from this and allow the private sector to bring in that efficiency and that new technology, and see whether they can, do it in a better way. So, of course, you would know that over the last few months, the government has announced an opening up of the space sector for the private sector. The idea is that private sector will come in, at least into certain niche areas, and will provide competition, if I can use that word, to ISRO in terms of bringing in better technologies, more cutting edge technologies, doing with faster turnaround time, etc. It's at a very nascent stage. We haven't yet seen any major work yet in this. There are some small examples. There are some companies that want to send up their own satellites and so on, which is underway. So I think in the course of the next year or two, we may see some improvements and some developments on that side. So I think my point is really that, yes, I agree with the need for looking at the way in which government does its procurements, obviously, because we spend a huge amount of money on it. Perhaps we need to see what we can do to get the existing system to work better. I know that PPPs and so on are very, 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 very good ideas. There's a lot of efficiencies that they bring in. But as you yourself pointed out, Ajay, when government capacities are so low, and we are just about able to manage to do the L1 system not very well, administering a PPP contract, as Shailesh said, contract administration is absolutely important. Administering a PPP contract is not at all an easy thing for government to do, which is where I think all the problems start. So I'd like to end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have some 20 minutes for discussion, and we can go off into any direction that people want. So, Susan, Anjali, Bhargavi, what would you like to say in connection to all this? And anybody else, can we please?
Ajay, if I may,
Yes,
on the
yes,
very last point that Sudha made, you know, administering a construction contract is difficult enough. Administering a PPP contract is going to be order of magnitude more difficult.
yes,
I'll just leave that thought.
yeah.
Yeah.
In the chat, Renuka is saying all too often government employees are scared and stick to the safe parts of GFR. Do we have good examples or case studies from cradle to grave about contracting outside the simple L1 path, where all in all the contract worked and there was no CVC, CBI problems? Can there be training on how these non-L1 processes can be followed? So that, what do you think? Is it
Yeah.
rare, or
So
is it something which is trainable?
it's rare in most of government, but it's not rare in the two departments that I just spoke about, which is space and atomic energy. As a matter of fact, I would say that in space, probably we do far more contracts on limited tendering and sole source requirement than we do on open tendering, which means uh, what's the difference between L1, the so-called L1, and the other procedures that I'm talking about? I think what Renuka is saying is that government tends to open up the contract, go in for an open tendering, and they just pick up the person whose bid is financially the lowest and not really bother about anything else. Renuka, I'd just like to clarify here that actually that doesn't happen, in the sense that what you do in an open tender is that you open it up to everybody who is similarly qualified or similarly placed. So there is a qualification, there is a technical qualification that comes in first. And so all vendors are brought on the same page before their financial bids are opened. And then, of course, L1 is picked up. Now, if L1 does not perform in that scenario, well, then that's probably due to poor tender document, which means you haven't assessed your need correctly. You're not very sure what you want. And so you keep making changes in the tender document later. And or B, poor contract management, which means you don't pay the vendor on time, you don't give him the clarifications that he needs on time, you don't give him the land on time, and so on. So that's really not, it's nothing to do with the fact that you picked L1. This is a general malaise in government on contract management, which is exactly what Shailesh was talking about. In space and atomic energy, as I said, we don't necessarily do a lot of open tendering. We do a lot of limited tendering where we work with a select group of vendors. And very often we do sole source, which means we go only to a particular vendor. And in fact, I should tell you, there are vendors with whom we have relationships going back for the last 20, 25 years. And I can assure you that there has been no CAG or no CVC complaint on any of them. Probably because the systems are robust. As I mentioned, the documentation is good. If you want to go, if you need to waive public tendering in these departments, this waiver is allowed at the level of the secretary of the department. He has to sign off on it. There are very senior scientists involved in the entire process. So the review mechanism goes right up to the very top. And they are willing to take, they are willing to be held accountable for the decisions that they are taking. This can tend to be a problem in most civilian government departments, probably because we don't have that kind of technical capability. Everybody is a bureaucrat and is not well versed with technical requirements and so on and so forth. So there is more fear, I think, in civilian departments to take these decisions. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. Professor Mashilkar, you were saying something?
Yeah, I'm saying something. Sudha, you were brilliant in what you said. I mean, I totally agree with you. Just this morning, I was with my friend Kakodkar in some other context. Let me make 2-3 points in response to what you said. Uh, First of all, the new waves that are coming now in the wake of Startup India, and I mentioned about Kerala and Maharashtra, with which I'm familiar. Not L1, but there is exemption model, there is direct procurement model, there is limited tender model, there is innovation zone model. So innovation is being done for sort of in this. And once that gets established, I don't think there is going to be a challenge at all. So I totally agree with you. That's number one. Number two is when you are dealing with science and innovation, you have to deal with it differently. In fact, I had a major challenge, by the way. I'll tell you a little story. I started this program when I was the director of National Chemical Laboratory on converting molasses to alcohol and alcohol to propionic acid, which was a very high value added product. Not just acetic acid, which is 5 rupees, but propionic acid, which would be 20, 25. Why did I do that? Because alcohol was 3 rupees per liter. And why was that? Because of the artificial way in which molasses prices were controlled. Then came liberalization, opening up, 1991. And I could quite clearly see that the molasses prices are going to shoot up, alcohol prices are going to shoot up. And therefore, actually, I closed the project. And I was proved right because there was another plan that was coming up on alcohol. They had spent 40 crore. But when it came to the audit part of it, there was an audit. I said, how come? I have saved the money for the government by closing it down because at 3 rupees it was viable, 3 rupees per liter, 10 to 12 rupees it was not viable, basically. So I think that fundamental understanding, that is one. The second is, science is an exploration. You aim at something, it is not road building. When you say 11 kilometers per day, oh, you have not built it, you built 9, etc. It is not that. So how do you educate these sort of people? That's the second. In fact, I had a big discussion with Vinod Rai. I was a member of his advisory council, me, Narayana Murthy, etc. And at that time, he had agreed that he will have one full day session on science auditing. How do we do that? Because we are exploring, basically, and when you explore, you take different paths. That's the third part. The last part I would say is again based on my own experience. I normally like to talk from my book of life rather than all these other books. So there, I must say, for example, when the Prime Minister announced Swachh Bharat, and there was a particular committee that was created under my chairmanship on selecting the best technologies. And I remember I wanted to make the process entirely objective, not subjective. So we created a framework within which we will do the selection. And that was called Assured Matrix. It is, by the way, I'm not trying to sell my book, but this is in the third chapter of this book, that I wrote, the pole vaulting. And how do you do that? How do you make assured success? So there's a framework we created, and that is called Assured Framework for Innovation. Affordable, scalable, sustainable, user-friendly, rapid, excellence in terms of technology, and distinctive, not me too. And in each of these cases, it is not qualitative, it is quantitative. You put numbers and you show that. So the success of innovation is sort of.
No. Google is down. Gmail is down.
And this has been now used sort of at so many places. Decisions.
Gmail is down across the board.
So what I'm trying to say, I want to end on a positive note that for all these problems, there are solutions which are trust-based, which are system-based. And once they are brought in, it can happen. The rest of the world has done it. Why not us? That is the big issue. The fear that you talked about, this assured framework actually protects them because they show that this framework, which is semi-quantitative or quantitative, has made those criteria. It's as simple as.
Okay, we are on our last 10 minutes. Can I quickly do some questions? Susan asks Sudha, even when you are buying pens or potatoes, which are like the simplest things, we see so many difficulties and frictions in the civil ministries. So what is going wrong? So one can understand, okay, I'm doing some complex procurement of a rocket engine, it's different. But we find civilian ministries fumble on absolutely basic procurement. What gives?
The problem, I think, in the run-of-the-mill procurements is really that we are not aggregating demand adequately. We try to, each individual department, each individual ministry is buying its own pens or its own potatoes or its own water bottles and so on and so forth. So we don't get, I think we run into problems when we, put out a bid for 10 pens or 100 pens or 5 kilos of potatoes, because obviously you're going to get very, very small vendors who will come in to meet your demand. Certainly an L&T is not going to come in. I mean, I'm just using this as a completely outlier example. What I mean is you're not going to get efficiency of supply. You're not going to get the better vendors. You're going to get the run-of-the-mill operators who may be a fly-by-night guy for all you know. So you may not get a pen that writes properly. You may get a potato that's rotten. One way to get over this problem is really, I think, to aggregate demand, and their government also benefits because you bring in efficiencies of scale, and the vendor also has some sort of an incentive to look forward to, which is why I think the whole idea of this gem is very good. Because it allows government departments to sort of put out all their requirements in the public domain, and so the vendor knows exactly what all is available and what he can bid for. Hopefully, you should get better quantities. I think that's one very major problem in the run-of-the-mill type of procurement that we are trying to do. The second, of course, is that normally for these smaller procurements, our standardized bidding documents are very, very poor. So we have very good standard bidding documents when we want to, as you said, procure a rocket engine. Not that we procure a rocket engine, but yes, we could, and we would have very good standard bidding documents for that. But we don't have equally good standard bidding documents when I want to procure a taxi service or I want to procure a pen. Now, this is where in some areas we need to work on getting better documentation in place and having better tender documents, which will help both government and the vendor, I think, because there is larger certainty.
Anjali, you wanted to ask a question. Can you please do it on audio?
Yeah. So, Ajay, my question is, and I would sort of ask any of the panelists to take it, or even you. Look, we know that there is no one thing called government, right? So there are many, many types of entities within government, and we know that we follow an extremely decentralized model of procurement. Now the question is, and we are procuring everything from pens to potatoes to medicines to rocket engines, as Sudha said. The question is, have we thought about the alignment of what we are procuring with the allocation of responsibility and the procurement model? So one of the questions that seems to bother me is that who is thinking about this? Who is planning this? So Sudha said that there is a problem of not enough demand aggregation. Now the question is anyone thinking and trying to solve this problem in any way, or is it that we've said, oh, there's GEM, now instead of putting 100 pens tender outside of GEM, you can put it on GEM. Now once you have 3 years of data on purchase of pens across departments on GEM, is there somebody who's thinking about what to do with this data and to move forward? So is there somebody who's thinking about the problem of public procurement and issues in various sort of nuances and saying we need to fix this or we need to fix that, or is that sort of the thing that is missing right now?
I would request Shailesh.
Yeah, I think Ajay and Anjali, I think we should not talk too much about procurement per se. We should talk about contracting. I'll tell you why. Buying a potato is a much simpler exercise than getting a power plant constructed using the private contractor, because it's a binary 1 or 0. You get the potato or not, the potato is of good quality or not. And actually procurement, if you ask me, is not such a big of a one-time thing. It's not such a problem. After all, as all of us know, the minimum support price procurement for the current paddy crop has procured something like 375 lakh metric tons. So procurement is a much simpler exercise than contracting, is the only thing I'd say. And there I would like to, in fact, offer some success stories. And I think the government e-marketplace is a brilliant idea. effectively it is like an Amazon. And what normally would happen in a private sector context is a marriage between LinkedIn and Airbnb, where each procurer of any such product would rate this seller. And this happens all the time on online platforms. So in the next 3 years, we will have a very good idea of who are the efficient people out there in terms of simple procurement. In contracting, I'd go back to this manual business. In every state's public works department or all works departments, whether it is PWD or irrigation or PHE, there is something called a works department manual. And it is time to understand what is the works department manual's problem in efficiency. So let me give you a success story here. The Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana had a process manual, and I've actually bid out PMGSY roads. So their process manual is infinitely superior to the works department manual of a state, right? Correspondingly, why does a large company like ours, not participate in urban local body tenders? Because the design and the contract documents of a national level, let us say a power project or an airport project, is far superior to the design and contract of a, let us say, a local a city municipal corporation. There are other successes like the Delhi Metro. After all, Delhi Metro was a contract to given to the private sector to construct it. Now, typically in the construction sector, there is something that we call an FIDIC contract. And Sudha was mentioning this. When we insist on a FIDIC contract, because we do massive work all over the world, the Indian sell side, which is the government, is very reluctant, because it will mean more accountability and less latitude for the government itself. So maybe it's time, as I said, to go to the situation in 1994 in the UK. My last point, is that the procurement business. I think the railways is the largest procurer of all goods and products annually. But in terms of construction, I'd say that the business of contract procurement and contract management is far superior at the national level with PSUs as well as the government of India. Where it really needs to be, where the game needs to be upped, is the cities and the states. So maybe your research could focus on that. Thank you.
Folks, Susan is saying that the next session starts in 2 minutes. So I'm afraid we will have to wind down. In the chat session, she has pasted the URL for the next session. So this URL comes to a close when this meeting comes to an end. So I'd like to thank Professor Mashelkar and Sudha and Shoilesh, who have been wonderful participants of this panel. Yes, and look forward to keeping up this conversation between all of us in the days to come. And our dream is to build a literature and be a part of solving these problems. Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, thank you. I echo Ajay's words. That was an awesome session. And I understand that time is often too short, especially when the sessions are awesome. And we will be getting in touch with all of you, perhaps together, perhaps individually, carry forward these discussions. But please join me in thanking all of our panelists and Ajay. It was wonderful, and I hope to see all of you at the next session, at the next link. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.